Next up, we have from the great state of Maryland, giving a talk, Dear Fellow Time Binder, Exploring Connections with General Semantics. And that's Dear Fellow Time Binder is the title of one of the two books of his out for sale on the table at a very reasonable price. Christopher Mayer.
Thank you. I'm also going to keep track of my time here. All right, so hello everybody. I want to open with a question. When you say I, what do you think about? What goes into that identity? What do you think of when you think of yourself? So I want to share with you a way to think about how to answer this question using general semantics. And I'm going to connect it with a few other thinkers and traditions as well. So I wrote this book that Lance mentioned called Dear Fellow Time Binder. It was published last year by the Institute. And the premise is really, it's a series of letters to a friend. It's fictitious that who wants to learn more about general semantics. And in the book, I have a chapter on Korzybski's chain index, which has always fascinated me, this idea that a thing is not identical to itself in different space-time. So like my iPhone here is not the same iPhone here as it is in my house. You know, for example, in my house, I have poor cellular coverage and it's on Wi-Fi here. I don't, so it can affect how the phone works. But it's more, that may be more trivial. It doesn't always matter. And the implications of the chain index, though, are pretty radical when you apply them to yourself or to other people. It teaches you that you are not identical to yourself in different situations, that you exist as an organism, as a whole, in an environment. So, where do you begin and where do you end? So we tend to think of ourselves as skin-encapsulated egos, as Alan Watts used to say, but even insides need their outsides. You need to have a place to stand, you have to have air to breathe, you also have a history, you have things that had to happen exactly as they happened for you to even be here at all. You have parents, parents have parents, and so on. And if you follow this train of thought long enough, you find that you eventually float the entire universe. Everything is connected to everything else. You are different, but are you truly separate? The chain index makes the environment part of the defining feature of the self. You can't extract it or separate it. Now, Korzybski himself didn't seem to explore this idea too much, but there are instances where he comes close. In Science and Sanity, he writes, Einstein realized that the empirical structure of space and time with which the physicist and the average man deals is such that it cannot be empirically divided, and that we actually deal with a blend which we have split only elementalistically and verbally into these fictitious entities. So I kind of zoned in on that phrase, fictitious entities, with the idea of a self also be a fictitious entity. What's interesting here too is Einstein definitely saw the more radical implications of this idea of organism as a whole in its environment. In my book, I include my favorite Einstein quote. I'll read it to you here. He says, a human being is part of the whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as someone separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and affection for a few persons nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Nobody is able to achieve this completely, but striving for such achievement is, in itself, a part of the liberation and a foundation for inner security, end quote. So here, he clearly gets at this idea of blurred edges of the self, and he sees it instead as being connected to everything else. I also like those strong words of delusion and prison, which we'll come back to. So back to Korzybski again. Most of the time when he's talking about organisms as a whole in their environment, he's not talking about people per se, but other organisms. At one point in Science Sanity, there's an extended discussion of jellyfish, for example. When he talks about people, he's more interested in empirical facts about them and their actions. But there are times, again, when he comes close to what Einstein is saying. So in Science and Sanity, page 376, he says, all forms of human activities are interconnected. It is impossible to select a special characteristic and treat it in delusional isolation as the most important, or elementalistic isolation as the most important. And again, on page 415, he says, events are interconnected. Everything in this world influences everything else, and happenings leave some traces everywhere. So there's interconnectedness, there's change, and change also interested Korzybski a great deal, as you know. The use of dates, one of Korzybski's working devices, reminds us that we live in a process world, a world where everything is changing all the time, including us. Korzybski explicitly recognizes and says so in the Olivet lecture. So, for example, he says at one point, I would deny that any electronic process is ever identical with itself. Are you identical with yourself from second to second? What you know about yourself should tell you that you are not identical with yourself from moment to moment. The problem I find a lot of times with Korzybski is sometimes the examples are kind of trivial, so it's technically true you're not identical with yourself from second to second, but that's probably not very interesting or significant. But if you pull it out more, it can really be interesting and radical. The self is ever changing, and Korzybski used the analogy once. He said, if you data look at old photographs of yourself, but more than outward appearances, there is change on the inside as well. One personal example is I've been keeping a journal, a daily journal, since 2005. And one of the remarkable things you can't help but learn when you keep a journal is how much you change. When I read over some of the oldest entries, I feel like I'm reading the words of a completely different person with different interests and different ideas. And I feel that way because I am a different person. Maybe my experience is more extreme, but if you kept a journal, even now, 2 decades, just a couple of years ago, I could read entries and they can be eye-opening. And the beauty of keeping a journal is that you can't lie to yourself. You actually wrote those things, you actually thought that, and now you don't. So I recommend keeping a journal. I mean, write even trivial things like favorite books, authors, movies, music, foods, all that kind of stuff I would put in there. It's kind of funny and interesting to see how you change. So on this idea, too, of an ever-changing self, I want to share a passage from a book titled A Study of Gurdjieff's Teaching by Dr. Kenneth Walker, which was published in 1963. Gurdjieff, if you don't know, died in 1949. He's primarily remembered as a teacher of a system of personal and psychological development. I mean, that's excessively reductive, but Walker's observation, which is this idea that you look at yourself almost in a third person, where you try to look objectively as possible at your own doings and thoughts and so forth. And the idea of this exercise is if you pursue it diligently over a stretch of time, that you'll learn something important about yourself. And so Walker did, and then he wrote about it in his book, and this is what he wrote, which I thought was interesting, and that actually inspired this talk. He says, I was surprised at the richness of the observations I made during the days observing myself, as though taking stock of some other person with whom I was only slightly acquainted. He says, perhaps the earliest and most disquieting of findings made in this way was that I was never the same for more than a few minutes, and yet I had the effrontery to preface many of my remarks with such misleading phrases as, I always think that, or I am convinced that, or that I feel strongly that. And he goes on to say, and who is it that was making this dogmatic statement about his own thoughts and feelings? Who, in short, was I? Over 2,000 years ago, Heraclitus proclaimed that everything flowed, and up till that moment, I had imagined that in uttering these well-known words, he was referring only to the world outside ourselves. Now, as a result of only 3 months' observation, self-observation, I realized that what was undoubtedly true of the world outside myself was equally true of the world within me. Everything flowed within me as it flowed without. So what exactly is the self then? Is it a fictitious entity, a kind of delusion? I want to bring in one other connection to general semantics. And I wrote about this person a little bit in my book. His name is Nisargadatta Maharaj. And he died. He was a famous guru in India. He died in 1983. Again, I'm being excessively reductive here, but anyway, he would have made a brilliant general semanticist. In fact, I toyed with the idea of doing the presentation entirely on him. Any kind of holistic thinking that I'm talking about. And in one talk, he used the example of an electric lamp. He said, it's because of the lamp, the wiring, the switch, the transformer, transmission lines, and the powerhouse form a single whole that you get the light. Any one factor is missing, and there would be no light. You must not separate the inseparable. Words do not create facts. They either describe them or distort them. The fact is always non-verbal. So in that, I see a lot of Korzybski, the not separating the inseparable, L and non-L thinking in general semantics, the idea that words are not the things they describe, and that the beginning of experience is non-verbal, also very Korzybski. Words, ideas, concepts, and abstractions, interwoven and interdependent, most wonderfully generating, supporting, explaining each other, yet mere creations of the mind. Words, again, a lot of echoes of Korzybski here. On this question of what you are or what you think of when you think of I, we too create an identity with words. Maharaj taught not to identify yourself with the words, instead be free of self-identification. He said, quote, as long as you have all sorts of ideas about yourself, you know yourself through the mist of these ideas, unquote. He implored people to go beyond personal obsessions and unnecessary self-identification with its bundle of memories and habits and affiliations. And instead he taught yourself as not truly separate, and that this would cultivate a feeling of I am the world and the world is myself. He said, once it is established, there is just no way of being selfish. Everyone yourself as not truly separate, and that this would cultivate a feeling of I am the world and the world is myself. He said, once it is established, there is just no way of being selfish. Everyone's welfare is one's own. So that sounds very familiar to what Einstein said in that quote before. And then consider the Korzybskian axiom, whatever you say a thing is, it isn't. Should this axiom also not apply to ourselves? We are not what we say, or perhaps we're not only what we say. Maharaj also said, very similar to Korzybski, whatever can be described cannot be yourself, and what you are cannot be described. What Maharaj teaches is a form of detachment with the aim of achieving an inner peace and tranquility free from anxiety and fear. A recognition that we are prolific creators or basically verbal prisons. So in conclusion here, how do you answer that question to start when you say I? What does that identity entail? Maharaj once answered it this way. He said, I am nothing in particular, and yet I am. On another occasion, he said, it's my favorite, he said, all I can say is I am, all else is inference. This reminds me of Exodus 3:14. And God said to Moses, I am who I am. These answers strike me as Korzybski, and Korzybski's ideas are radical when you follow them all the way through, and that they challenge basic, long-standing, unchallenged assumptions of what could be more basic than the notion of a separate self, of a stable, identifiable I. I believe the idea of a stable, readily identifiable self is a kind of fiction created by separating what is inseparable and by ignoring the wise insights which I've been speaking about. Even if you don't buy this argument in its entirety, perhaps I can at least nudge you to take the idea of yourself and your professed identities with more circumspection and more detachment. I think holding on to identities with a light touch will certainly bring down the temperature of a lot of political discourse. As G.K. Chesterton said, angels can fly because they can take themselves lightly. So I think I have a couple more minutes, so maybe one more minute. I want to tell a bad joke that I heard. It relates to this. So you probably maybe have heard this, but as a Buddhist monk, what does the Buddhist monk say to the hot dog vendor? Make me one with everything. And then the second part of that is he pays his money and he asks the vendor, well, where's my change? And the vendor says, change comes from within. So that's that.
Thank you, Chris.